So today I'll be talking about data validation in Ember apps. Why do I even feel like I want to have this talk? Is that I saw like there are a few reasons. One being that it seems like a lot of people, especially junior ones, think that add-ins are, for example, some magical packages that work only in Ember. I mean, they do, but they also think that like regular JavaScript libraries like probably won't work in Ember, which is also JavaScript. So this is one of the reasons, and the other is like a little bit of experimentation, because later on, as you can see on the agenda, we'll be building our own wrapper around a YOP validation library, which is vastly used in JavaScript overall and also in browser and Node environment as well. And also, before we start building it, we'll go through some of the Ember add-ins that you probably are familiar with. Not sure if I introduced myself. So my name is Bartlomiej Dudzik. I'm a software engineer at Simple Apps. You can find me on GitHub and Twitter under and Bob Imperator alias. So let's go through the Ember add-ins. So Ember Validations, I added it just for the sake of, let's say, documenting it, like just to raise some awareness, because in the past, like my 2 or 3 years of my career, I've been doing mostly upgrading Ember apps. And I've encountered it multiple times for some reason, even though it's been literally archived for 5 years, which is not so cool. And yeah, as you can see on the bullet point, it's been archived in favor of ember-changeset, which we'll also be covering a bit. So next up is Ember Model Validator. Actually, I haven't re-encountered this one, but I also went through the implementation, and there are a few things. It's a bit more Ruby-centric, like it's got a lot of semantics that you could probably see in Rails. The other thing is that it's working with multiple data types, but mostly it's targeting models. And because of that, it's the biggest flaw of the solution here is that it's actually appending our validation errors into the errors list on the model. And why is that bad? Is that if you receive an errors through network, they will be appended to that list, but we are also appending validation errors into that. So I don't think that's generally a good idea. It'd be nice to have that split. But the good thing about that is that it has a really simple validation definitions. So I also included like links to the repo, so you can look that up yourself later. Next up is Ember Sap-validations. It's been my favorite, honestly. I always like working with it, but it has some issues now. One being that it's mixin-based, and because it's mixin-based, it doesn't work with Glimmer components. This is also part of the reason why I started experimenting and building my own validation library based like wrapper building with YOP. But the good thing is that it adds little surface to the context actually with that mixin. So I think it will be possible that we will see ember-cp-validation in a different form, like in a form that we use ember-changeset, which is kind of using like a delegate button, which we'll be also using for the wrapper. And finally, we have ember-changeset validations, specifically ember-changeset validations, because ember-changeset and ember-changeset validations are connected, but they're not the same thing. It's more of a plugin for ember-changeset, and ember-changeset could also be like a general thing you could use if you wanted to like have an additional step, like a proxy to your data, so you don't set directives into it and run some validations, maybe even hook up our own wrapper. So the changeset validations is cool because it proxies our data. Like a lot of times when we are working with stuff, like maybe like especially a few years ago, we were heavily using two-way binding. And this was especially when changeset and changeset validations were really good. And it doesn't add anything to your models or components. It's also important to me because it's using this delegate pattern, which does not do anything magical without you knowing, like you have the class that you have to initialize. But the thing that I don't like about ember-changeset is that for some reason, I'm not sure why is it encouraging the way of initializing changeset through a helper. I always found that a bit weird. And if you wanted to initialize it in a component, then you would have to also, another thing, like you have to import the validations map, bind it to a component, and from that component, bind it to a template. Maybe this is something that template imports will solve in the future, if they happen, but I don't know. It's a little bit more set up, in my opinion, than it should be. And finally, we'll be working on building our own wrapper using Ember.js. So I set a few goals for it. So it has to be usable in a model component. You could probably use it everywhere. And it also has to accept any form of data that we put into it, because we want to stay on the more JavaScript side. Some Ember primitives like models are making it a bit harder, but we can work around that pretty easily. It has to have easy validation rule definitions, which is, I think, it has like a build pattern, so it's really pretty actually as well. It has to have the delegated state. It needs to have easy to implement control flows, because a lot of times, I'm pretty sure you also had to do some conditional validation of your data for internationalization, and finally support Ember data models. So we'll define the API before starting with implementation, but honestly, like how I planned it and how it turned out was exactly the same. But first we can take a look at YAP documentation to see what we are working with. So here they import everything from as YAP. You don't have to, you can use ES6 partial imports. So we are importing an object module called a shape method on it. And then within that shape, we define an object which has a key value pairs and the values being the validation rules using all the schemas. And this is like the sample model. In this example, I wanted to maybe show an alternative for model validator as well. We define our validations on a model. We import our class, we import YAP schemas. And finally, we initialize the class, so it will receive the data. In our case, it's the model instance, and then we provided the shape. So it has name and age, which are required. As you can see, we have name and age attributes, as well as has many relationship to, which we'll use a bit later. This is how I would imagine it to use. So we get our model, we access the validation, and call a validate method. Then we can do whatever we want with our model once it's validated. Here is like a pseudo error message component that will accept a list of messages, and the messages will need to be on the easily accessible through some object of some kind that we have the aggregated validation errors. Let's go with the implementation. So I felt pretty confident putting it on the one slide, though it doesn't look that good. It's roughly like 60 lines of code. It's basically everything we need. We'll change 2 lines of code later to support all the scenarios. So basically, we have a constructor that accepts context and shape, and then we immediately build the YAP schema out of that. And also we define a tracked error property. Then we have field errors, a computer property, which is using the error, reads the errors list if the error exists, and reduces it into one object where a key is the name of the property in a shape, and then we append the errors under that key. So next is a validate method. So the schemas have validate method. Will error if it fails. So we wrap it in a try-catch. Then we provided the data through the validation properties method, and also pass it some configuration. We need the abort error because otherwise, if you detected one error, it would stop validating, which most of the time for forms isn't the desired behavior. And then we clear out the error and return true. Otherwise, we get the error from catch, save it to our instance, and return false. And finally, we have the validation properties method. The method only will get the data out of our object that also exists in a shape, because our object can have different data, but the shape only validates all the keys. Then we have internationalization. This is how it looks like in YAP. We can see that we can provide functions to handle the locales, and this is what we'll do as well. So here we have like a small helper function that you provide a key and also a list of values that you should get from validation parameters that are coming from you. Our message is just a key, a path, which is the, for example, name, values, object, which we can use for a concatenation of, well, some validation constraints in our messages. So again, like here is a demo. So like this is exactly the same. This is something we would find in our component, and then we have a form which like it's nothing interesting. It's just a few fields, and on the GIF over here you can see that our data is validated correctly, and everything is also as I planned. We provide the list of messages from a certain key, and we show it, and that's it. But you also can see that the pet relationship does not work yet, so we can fix that real quick. So we can create some schema relationship. So we have some validations on our pet as well. It has a required name and also has some relationship, which doesn't really, to an owner. Then also, again, from documentation, we can see that allows us to create our like a custom tests, which we can use, and also extend the modules with our own functions. Like they do here, they add a new method into the date module, so we'll do just that as well. So finally, this is the implementation as well. So we add new method into object and array modules, which is a relationship function. And this function is just for belongs to relationship. This would be just a test that takes the model, reads validations from it, and then calls a validate method. But in case on array, it's a bit more complicated in a way that we need to first transform our relationship into a list. And then we can create a test that will iterate through all the items and validate them. And then we just show the outcome based on if every validation is true. And here is the fixed model. Like only one property has been added. So we only added the array module and the custom relationship method. So just to show that there is some link between models, and we'll see that the form didn't really change at all. Another nice thing about the op that might come in handy is that we could also do inline relationship validation. Like the advantage of that would be that if you have a different schema in different places, then it will be a bit harder for you to get the error messages together. But with something like that, all the will be coming from one schema, so we will have all of them. So we here basically say that we want to transform the model into a list, and then we only allow the valid shape over here, which is basically the same as what we provided to pet. So we have object shape and which name is required. So here is also on the left side, you can see the errors that we are getting this time. Like there's one small caveat to using the inline validations, but we can work around that real quick as well. So these are the errors that we have on the left, and on the right side we are showing them. But the caveat here is that now we have this weird path to pets, which have index inside their names and all of that. And because of that, we can't really use like ember-get for that, because ember-get will think that name is a nested property of some object, which is not. So here, the solution is just to have a small helper, just get a path, and we have a, quite not so pretty way to create the key, but it's serving its purpose. You could probably do something better with that. And finally, we have conditional validations. So we'll reuse the inline validation now, and YOP has a really nice support for conditional validating. So it has a when method which accepts a list of properties it will in its schema or context, and then we can say that basically when a user is allergic, then we can say that the string is not required, otherwise it's required. And we also pull the is allergic into the shape of a user, but to access the is allergic property, we'll need to the properties again as a context, so we can reuse that in like a more in the nested shape that we have for pets. So now, as you can see, if a user is allergic for whatever business reason, we either require or not require the name of a pet. This is it. In the summary, I mentioned the popular Ember add-ons, and maybe some you could also see from some alternatives between them. Create integration module with non-Ember library using Tract, and have like a nice way to one model to another within validation. Validated relationship data inline because it might come in handy. Support multi-language environments, and also created conditional validations. So that's it.